Hey there, Twitter fam. It is hashtag Malkin Live. We've got an epic edition for you today. And I know so many of you were up late last night, like I was, tracking the latest paroxysm of violence, this time in Minneapolis in the aftermath of the notorious George Floyd incident. And my first guest is a friend of mine and an investigative journalist who I believe is just one of the best in the business. And because he's one of the best among the few truth tellers left in the Fourth Estate, of course, he's always constantly under attack. And I woke up this morning and saw his name trending on Twitter and absolutely had to bring him in. It's Mr. Andy No. Hi, Andy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on, and I apologize to the viewers and listeners that I don't have my webcam available at this moment.
Not a problem. We've got your voice and you're coming through crystal clear. I wanted to sort of go back earlier in the night last night. Can you bring us back to when you started covering this and what you were seeing?
Yeah, so a lot of attention obviously today has been on the race riots that broke out in Minneapolis last night and very early this morning, but it actually happened, things started the day before that, so that would have been on Tuesday, the 26th. On that day, the day after the shocking, disturbing video released of Mr. George Floyd final encounter with law enforcement. The following day, there was a violent riot outside a police precinct in Minneapolis. And law enforcement responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. They were quite roundly criticized by politicians such as Ilhan Omar. They were accused of using a heavy hand. Mind you, these rioters were throwing rocks. They were smashing cars in the parking lot. So there was violence and destruction that day. Unfortunately, the next day it happened again, but this time was magnitudes larger. We're many hours out from the apex of the violence in the early hours after midnight. But this morning, as of this morning, you still see the smoldering ruins and of what remained of basically an entire neighborhood, entire block, buildings razed to the ground in arson attacks. What's very sad is that probably the largest fire was of a affordable housing building complex that was under construction, and that was completely destroyed. There's nothing left. Target was completely ransacked. Auto parts store was looted and then burnt. So, it's the U.S. has had a bit of reprieve from these race riots. The last years that we saw somewhat similar scenes was in 2014 through 2016, sort of at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement then. And I think a lot of people naively assume that this ideology movement has sizzled out because we had sort of 4 years of relative, the protest has switched focus on other issues. But I think what the violence that happened last night, which resulted in one death, by the way, of an alleged looter, it was different from some of the other ones that happened in Baltimore and Ferguson in that there was the Antifa element there played a very important role in moving in after looters had stolen and ransacked property, and then the Antifa element started the fires that were meant to destroy what was left.
Yeah, that is an interesting twist or an interesting different flavor to these riots, so that there was a combination of both kind of the usual opportunism that I've covered all the way back to the 1992 riots in Los Angeles after the Rodney King incident, all the way through the riots that we saw. Even in Minneapolis, actually, of course, Minneapolis has a history of embedded agitators. from the far left or the progressive left during the Republican National Convention in 2008. They wrought a lot of havoc there, and so they've been sort of a layer, an underbed of agitation in the Twin Cities for quite a while. So you have this conflagration, right? Because there are there were, I mean, of the videos that I saw, Andy, yes, there were plenty of people who seemed to be genuinely motivated by the outrage from the George Floyd incident. And then there were plenty of people that were there to just get, free diapers and help themselves to lamps at Target. I actually saw that, and big bags of candy.
And HDTVs.
HDTVs, yes. Right. Social justice looting. But then, as you remarked and on your Twitter feed showed, there were plenty of people who looked like the very familiar Black Bloc types and Antifa types that you've been documenting and, of course, are writing a book about. Do you think that there was actual coordination there, or it was just sort of a kind of natural leveraging of these various anti-law and order forces?
I think it's both. The organization that I saw happen in real time on social media, because the riots lasted for hours and hours, and law enforcement responded a little bit in the beginning. The firefighters responded to the fire at the auto store, but they were attacked with rocks. And then it seems like after that, it looks like there was some type of stand down because there was just no response at all as buildings were being torched left and right for the next 12 hours or so. I think that the clearest evidence of Antifa's presence there, in addition to the Black Bloc uniforms that they wear and the tactics of bringing bats and other weapons to destroy windows and cars and businesses, is that you see them tagging their slogans, which if people aren't familiar with them, they may miss it. I mean, these are dog whistles, numbers like 1312, which stands for ACAB, all cops are bastards, all kill all pigs. A lot of these really extremist anti-police sentiment is coming from the Antifa extremists. And then looking at some prominent Antifa accounts on Twitter, of course, they started crowdfunding a jail bail fund for any of their comrades that may have been arrested. As far as I know, there weren't any arrests last night. The city just let rioters have their space to destroy and
safe space for the rioters, which, of course, if you juxtapose it like I did last night to the arrests of many peaceful citizens over the last couple of weeks who participated in anti-lockdown protests, it's quite a contrast because, I was part of some of those protests here in Colorado, and we were accused of inciting violence. And I mean, it's nothing like we've seen in Minneapolis the last couple of days. Also, it's breaking out other places as well. It wasn't nearly as violent or smoky in LA, but there were marches on LAPD precincts as well. You mentioned Ilhan Omar, and I saw an interesting tweet from you about some activity that her daughter was engaged in yesterday. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, her 17-year-old daughter tweeted out a list of things that some rioters in Minneapolis were requesting supporters and comrades to bring in, things like plywood, sticks, rackets. When you put that in context of her mother seemingly approving of and asking for those who are mourning to have their space, it's really disturbing. I think it reflects on Ilhan Omar. She's a lawmaker and seems to have a very long history of really undermining the rule of law, and her daughter is tweeting out support for criminal violent behavior. I think, and then Ilhan Omar is not the only Democrat politician who seems to have like a soft spot for Antifa, or somebody in their family having that. Reminding people of how Senator Tim Kaine's son was actually arrested and charged for his role in being part of an Antifa Black Bloc riot in, I believe it was also in Minnesota, actually,
Yeah.
at the state capitol. So um, I think over time, we're going to see more of this convergence of uh, fringe anti-flag extremism moving more and more into the mainstream. I'm really glad you brought up the media's treatment of the reopened protesters, because they were so viciously maligned, and not just maligned, but actually were the victims of disinformation. People who
Yes.
Photoshop signs with alleged Nazi slogans, appropriating pictures from protests that happened months ago and blaming that on these reopened demonstrators. And then you compare that to all the people on the mainstream left legitimizing the violence that happened last night and this morning.
Yes.
And that's actually very important to the role of the violent far left. They have to draw legitimacy from media and the mainstream left, because otherwise, uh, the state is going to come down against them for the criminal activity. But if they are able to sort of continue to spread their message through sympathetic media, that's a moving them further towards their goal.
Yes, sympathetic media and sympathetic social media. And this is a good segue into a couple of the death threats that were leveled against you last night for merely covering these riots. And I know that it's just really the tip of the iceberg. You've been subjected to these kinds of threats for several years now because of your work. One of them, I'll just read it from someone named Trey Wright, says Antifa clearly didn't do enough when they beat your ass senseless. They should have killed you. And then another one from a user who called himself Endless Cemetery. I want to break Andy Ngo's jaw so bad. Don't ever come to Baltimore. These have not been censored. There's no fact checking appendage attached to them. These accounts are still up and operating at a time when, Twitter is clamping down on the free speech of users under the guise of public health and safety. How do you explain this double standard?
So I was trending on Twitter, unfortunately, not because of the new attention I was bringing to what was happening in Minneapolis, but because of the left-wing backlash against what they saw was footage that painted their movement and ideology in a bad light. Um, in addition to seeing people destroying properties and looting, there was also video of them attacking a woman who was trying to stop the looting at Target, a woman in a wheelchair, actually. So this barrage of onslaught of threats and wishes of violence in my DMs and all that, it's you know, uh, it's to me, it makes me feel a bit of shame that so many of my fellow American citizens revel and celebrate such wickedness. And I'm not a religious person, but I use that term because I find these actions and the ideology behind it actually wicked. Um, you look at the videos of last night, and you would forget that we're in the middle of a pandemic, to see
Right.
how
Right.
this impunity that they had, um, and they're destroying people's livelihoods at a time when we have record unemployment and people are suffering. And for them, this is just these are the eggs that they're willing to break to try to make the revolution omelet. It's a wicked
Mm.
ideology, needs to be called out. But unfortunately, for the past 5 years, it's been mainstreamed, it's been legitimized. People aren't even aware of the Marxist roots of the Black Lives Matter ideology, how its founders have praised convicted terrorists and fugitives. So it's no surprise that these protests on this ideology brings out this violence and brings out deaths. In 2016, we had two very mass casualty attacks on law enforcement in Dallas and Baton Rouge in Louisiana, which people have conveniently forgotten.
Yes, yes, that's right. It is evil. And, you don't have to be a person of faith to describe it that way, as you trenchantly note. Uh, there's so much disinformation, and the disinformation is paired with dehumanization. I mean, to me, it is just so appalling, even after all of these years of covering these types of riots, to see how desensitized people can be when a woman who is in a wheelchair trying to stop looting is smacked in the face, maced, beaten, assaulted all over her body, robbed, and nobody steps in, not a single human being, to help assist her and to stop that violence, which supposedly is being perpetrated in the name of stopping violence. I mean, it's and it never seems to end, and so there's a sort of obvious question: why does it keep happening? Right after the '92 riots, there was essentially a multi-billion-dollar reparations package. I mean, the behavior was rewarded, and it was violent agitators and inflammatory rhetoricians like Maxine Waters, who rose to power because of it. And over again, it gets rewarded. And there's no chance for the criminal justice system to work in any functional way because this is rigging the game. I mean, if there's a jury that knows that their city is going to get set on fire if they don't return the right verdict, how does the presumption of innocence ever even survive all of that? Now, you live in Oregon, you've covered Portland, you see the same types of things. What was your assessment of how the police handled it? Because, of course, they came under immediate fire by at least one city councilman on Twitter for not stepping away enough.
Right. Well, I've written about this for Newsweek, actually, looking about what's the matter with police departments, usually in Democrat cities where they have an extremely hands-off or laissez-faire attitude towards left-wing political violence. It observing what was happening last night and this morning, it looked there had to be a stand-down order. And actually, if you listen to some of the radio calls that some people were tracking online, that's essentially what was happening. And I have a bit of sympathy for that. I understand that, they they were attacked. And so they were so outnumbered. And then on top of that, they're facing such political pressure, not just from the local government, but nationally, actually. And so they choose just to let the city burn. The people who suffer are those who live there. They're not the Twitter checkmark people who live in Brooklyn and LA, and who cheer this on from thousands of miles away. I think what we're witnessing is a really disturbing current that's happening in American society, where large sections of the population have lost all faith in the rule of law and our legal institutions. And that's why they're calling for revolution and burning everything down, because they don't even believe in reform or change. They believe that the country at its core is so irredeemable that it must be destroyed. And they view state institutions, legal institutions, and of course police as sort of the bulwark against them achieving that goal. So it's natural that these extremists of all sorts on the left who have differing ultimate agendas are partnering together. That's why you have Antifa, who are mostly white people, being sort of like a militant arm of BLM.
Right, right. So last night, some of these forces descended on the home of the cop. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Derek Chauvin or Chauvin.
Uh-huh.
And you tweeted about this, that in fact that there was a plan to wreak violence at his home.
Yeah, I think his address was posted everywhere on social media,
Mm.
and the law enforcement there responded by having dozens and dozens of officers around the property because people were there for blood. They made it very clear that they wanted revenge. Again, it points to this a breakdown of civil society, civilization, actually, going back to sort of these animalistic impulses for mob rule, vigilante justice, right? Literally showing up at somebody's home, just short of having pitchforks, wanting to kill. And if not kill, then completely destroy the property. And the only thing that was stopping them was an army of law enforcement there. Um, a this Yeah, I'm not optimistic about where this country is moving. I think we may have certain periods, months, or even a few years of uh, these type of really violent riots going dormant, but then it comes up again because the ideology has a influence and sway, and it's seeping into more and more mainstream society, into education, the education of young children. So it's linked by extension to the um, ideology that's been marinating students in academia for decades. This sort of, I guess I would call it cultural Marxism. I do think it's quite fit. There's this agenda to bring about a revolution, but working on it through the culture. And they've captured media, they've captured in many places government, and so this these are dark times, I feel.
Yeah, I call it end stage America. And, on the one hand, it seems like weird consolation to say, as I did last night while this was all going on, we've seen this movie before. It's happened before, and so there's always this sort of salve that, oh, we'll get through it. And it just seems like the paroxysms keep getting worse and worse. And like you say, I think it's a really good point to talk about the difference in the chemistry of these types of mobs now. Uh, during the 92 riots, there were all sorts of agitators of color, right? Perpetrators of so-called civil unrest, as Maxine Waters so euphemistically described it. There, of course, was a burgeoning illegal alien population even back then in South Central LA and East LA, where there were sort of ancillary riots. And then there was this terrifying aspect of the riots where Korean business owners were left on their own to defend themselves, and the different type of racial dynamic there, the resentment that had been brewing, all just sort of burst out of the seams with the Rodney King beating as the catalyst for it. Here, there's black and white. Of course, Minneapolis, there's the huge refugee element, which adds a whole nother flavor to it. I used that word before. And then, at least at the time in the early 90s, there was still somewhat of a black middle class left in South Central LA. That's been completely destroyed. So I don't know if you noticed this, but there were a couple of tweets last night from local black business owners whose businesses were destroyed. And I found it very interesting because, I mean, there was one owner of a wig shop, and she said, well, I thought maybe we would have been protected, right? She seemed just a little bit disappointed that they didn't get some kind of exemption or pass. But then she was very quick to say, but I still supported the protesters. How do you explain that mindset?
Well, you saw that actually in Ferguson and Baltimore as well. These small businesses that were targeted. I think a certain amount of it, if I was to speculate, probably has to come from their fear of not wanting to be targeted again. Certainly, if you come out and openly criticize what these extremists are doing, and they're able to tie you to a physical location such as a business, they will target it again.
Yeah.
And even if you do everything you can to appease them. I remember the liquor store in Ferguson had all these signs that were in support of Michael Brown and his supporters, and it still got ransacked multiple times. So it's a bit futile, but I understand if you being in that type of position where they can't necessarily physically leave unless they just close shop.
Right.
Michelle, since some of those other earlier incidents of race riots that happened in America, I'm too young to understand the context behind it, the political and social context at that time. Do you feel that this is the same movie again, or are there significant differences in it that make the outcome less predictable to you?
Yeah, there are a couple of huge differences. And one is the saturation of social media and the influence that it plays in shaping people's perception. Back in the early 90s, there were still 3 major networks, and that's how you got your news fed to you, those 3. And there wasn't a ubiquity of people with video cameras who had agendas and who were essentially manufacturing the story as it happens in real time. And so we have a few minutes left, and I want to talk to you about this specific aspect, because this was not a factor in the early 90s. I mean, you had so-called professionals who were on the scene. You had people in helicopters overhead that were, owned by the local news stations. And for all the faults and flaws of the media over the years, those were the so-called reliable sources that were capturing all of this video and also disseminating news stories based on it. But as you pointed out all last night and this morning, of course, which is what got your name trending, there were all of these lies that are allowed to percolate. Yes. And again, on platforms that are supposed to be neutral, right? Platforms that are supposed to protect our safety, make sure that there aren't incitements to violence. And in addition to the tweets that I read that were aimed at you, I also noticed, and I remarked, and I had screenshot, whatever the conjugation is, an account that called itself "Killing Cops is Okay," and was inciting violence, in the moment, telling people, that this person was disappointed that they hadn't overrun the police department yet or shot cops. How are we supposed to counter this? And this is a good way to close out too, because, is an executive order from Trump going to stop this?
I think watching disinformation play out in real time can be quite a bit surreal. People, humans are drawn to stories, right? Particularly stories that confirm our biases. And just yesterday, there were very prominent Twitter verified people who spread lie about who this former cop is, Derek Chauvin. They juxtaposed a picture of him with somebody who wasn't him, allegedly wearing a very inflammatory hat, and using that as evidence that he was a white supremacist or something, to sort of whip up more rage and hatred. Some of that happened as well with Gregory McMichael just a few weeks ago with fake pictures that were attributed to him. Um, you know, this sort of open new media landscape allows somebody like me to have a platform. The flip side of it is it also allows huge numbers of people to spread disinformation and make it go absolutely viral and to incite violence. And this is a very big challenge, not just for big tech, but for all of us. How do we move forward with navigating what is objective truth versus lies, and lies that have deadly consequences?
Yeah. In the old days, I used to say it and I believed it, that the cure for speech with which we disagree or speech that we consider bad speech was more speech and better speech. And for the longest time, that worked.
Mm-hmm.
But when the playing field is rigged, and when the political opponents on one side or the other are in charge of those levers of power and are the actual gatekeepers, there's no way that this can work in any functioning, healthy way. And I guess we're just going to have to see how the executive order plays out. But increasingly, people are realizing that Twitter and Facebook are having a very toxic effect on race relations, on people's attitudes about the media, on what they can trust or not. And then I think, worrisome from a political perspective, how it's going to affect the outcome of the November elections as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Andy, thank you so much for your time. And I want people to know, of course, that you can follow Mr. Andy No. By the way, I saw that you were able to put what's the name of the little triangle thing on top of the O?
Oh, that accent mark? That's
Yeah,
actually how it's written in Vietnamese. So
that
it
is so
changed.
cool.
Yeah.
Because you
So
didn't used to have that before, but now it's
no.
there.
Yeah. Now I'm a bit more ethnic looking in my name.
Yeah, that's going to trigger people. So follow at Mr. Andy No on Twitter. And also, here is your Patreon, which I urge people to support the work that you do. You're so invaluable. Appreciate your work, your dedication to the truth, and your friendship.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's
You
been a
bet.
pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. All right, so that was Mr. Andy No, and I'm going to bring in right away our next guest. Hey, Rob.
How are you, Michelle?
Awesome. All right, we are all linked in. This is Rob O'Donnell, and I'm just going to read from your biography at Law Enforcement Today. You started out as a New York City transit cop, which merged into the NYPD in '95. You were promoted to special assignment police officer and then on to detective. Worked for the Organized Crime Control Bureau, the Precinct Detective Squad, retired out of one of the department's homicide task forces in 2004. And during your tenure, of course, were a part of history. You were involved in the '93 World Trade Center bombing response and rescue, of course, the recovery and response to 9/11. You were injured in the line of duty and also involved in investigating the Fort Dix terror plot suspects in 2007. You make your home in Pennsylvania. And of course, I know you because of the incredible philanthropic work that you do for the law enforcement nonprofit charity Brothers Before Others. And I absolutely wanted to have you on today to give the law enforcement perspective on everything that's been happening. First, let's talk about, before we get to all of the riots, the actual incident involving George Floyd and what your assessment is of what you've seen. Obviously, we don't have all of the facts, but what's your, given all of your experience, what's your assessment of what you've seen?
There's no doubt the incident with Mr. Floyd is tragic, and it concerns me greatly. It not only concerns me, it troubles me. From what I've saw, is not consistent with a lot of training that we get in law enforcement across the nation. The time that it was there, the time that the pressure was applied to the neck, concerns me. I'm not all that familiar. From what I'm reading, there are limited chokeholds and behind the neck restraints that are allowed by the Minneapolis Police Department in their procedures, which I found. So, we'll have to see what consistency there was, but there is no question, no doubt that, it was uncalled for that fact, in my opinion. Looking at the different videos that are out there, you get these small snapshots of what happened. You saw the time that the pressure was applied to the rear of the neck from the knee, which again, with a handcuffed suspect, no one I know, can find that reasonable at this point. And then there's the videos from the restaurant that show the before incident where he was taken out of the car. He was not actively resisting, but he was not overly compliant either. If you look at that video, and that video shows them dealing with him, at that stage, putting him up against the wall. He is handcuffed at that point. You can tell he is agitated, but he is not actively resisting. And then he's walked across the street to where their patrol car is. And that's when that restaurant video cuts out. And the narrative is, well, he was never resisting. Well, the incident that took place where he was placed to the ground and restrained, regardless if it was called for or not, cuts at that point. That's not seen. There are body cam videos. You can see the officers there wearing body cams. I'm really interested to see what they show. But, if they show him even non-compliant with that many officers there, with the fact that he was handcuffed, if I'm handcuffed and I'm resisting actively, it's going to take more than 2 or 3 people to keep me down. Was he? I want to see that answer. If he wasn't, then there's totally no justification for what was happening. And even if he was, the second he became compliant, that pressure needs to be taken down a notch. It needs to be released. So it's troubling. It's without a doubt needs to be investigated. It needs to be looked at. But here's where the pushback comes from the communities that we deal with, and my position of dealing with this in the public in the social media world. When I speak out on such and I wait, there's processes for this. Yes,
Oops, I think we've got Rob cutting out here. Hang on a second, everybody. All right, we'll see if we can reconnect to Rob. And we'll try and reconnect him. All right, let's see. No, we're just having some technical difficulties here. We'll try and get Rob back. Okay, he's going to try and reconnect. If any of you have questions, let me know. I'm looking up in chat here. And I think where he's going, of course, is that there is a process for investigating excessive use of force. And from my experience in covering these things, of course, these usually go to internal affairs. And, I know that there's a lot of corruption in a lot of IA departments, and I certainly covered it when I was an editorial writer and columnist at the Los Angeles Daily News. But if we don't bolster confidence and neutrality in these processes, then we're just going to get the same kind of pattern and cycle of mob rule, mob violence, and capitulation to the agitators and to the enemies of law and order. And what these riots do is poison the well and put an enormous amount of political pressure on the detectives who are investigating, the prosecutors who are handling these cases and deciding whether or not to bring charges, and certainly all of the political officials whose incentives then become in appeasing mobs rather than pursuing justice. It is an appalling development that after all of this time of America witnessing and suffering these kinds of violent outbreaks, that we are not a serious country and we still haven't been able to or willing to handle these types of situations in any type of proper manner. And I think I've got Rob back on. Hey, we got you. Yes.
Sorry about that.
So you were, no worries. You were talking about the fact that we have means of handling these types of situations. And, you know, it's great that we have you here to talk about your experience with this, because explain how these would normally be handled when you have cases of suspected excessive use of force.
Yeah, what immediately would happen is, you know, you obviously have your department investigation right off the bat. You have your internal affairs investigation. The district attorney will be brought in at that point if need be, you know, for a grand jury investigation. So you not only the district attorney is given an independent investigation, they're presenting that before a grand jury. You could have a state attorney brought in. You can have the U.S. Department of Justice come in with you know, civil rights, which it looks like the president already ordered that they look into this. You know, so there's multiple levels of that to look into that, and I welcome that in this case and any case where suspected abuse is brought on. What I don't like and what I don't like to see is this being used for the same thing that they on the left and, you know, the individuals who say, you know, these communities are being mistreated by the police is generalize the police. You know, the same very things they accuse us of: profiling, you know, racial profiling, social profiling. You know, when an incident like this happens, they immediately profile every law enforcement officer in the nation as being bad rogue cops, and the statistics just do not grasp that. So when I speak up of something like this and say something that I saw with Mr. Floyd is a here, you know, it's disgraceful to see what I saw, the little pieces that I've seen as so far. You know, I'm hoping to see more with the investigation. But when I speak that out, they say, well, now you talk. Well, now you speak up.
Right.
Well, you know, we can turn that around easily. I applaud the protests for Mr. Floyd's, the peaceful protests that started to take place when this happened. But that's not what's happening now. There's full-blown riots. There's mayhem in Minneapolis. Where are those same people, those good protesters who want to seek change and a dialogue between police and the community, stopping those rioters? Where are they to say, you know, you're hijacking our cause? This is doing nothing but taking the focus away from that. And I speak about this all. Does work need to be done between the police community? Always. We can always do better. You know, even when you take the stats, and even if it's a minute cases of police officers that deal with the public in a harsh manner or a bad manner or an unlawful manner, you know, we can do better to do that. The next thing they'll say is, well, how come those cops, how come those officers, how come myself doesn't stop the bad cops? Well, we do all the time. No one hates a bad cop worse than a good cop.
Right.
And anytime I've seen anyone in my career, you know, push the envelope, you know, maybe take liberties upon themselves, or you know, not even if they broke the law, then that's being reported. You know, it's always been my job to correct that or then. And if you look at this video, you know, the one officer there kind of walks up and he looks like he wanted to kind of say something, but then he was distracted by the protesters and or didn't have the fortitude to say, hey, get your knee off his neck, you know, because he was a more senior officer of that. You know, these are all things that need to be looked at, you know, but from what I saw in that, it looked like at one point one of the officers did see something that, okay, maybe this is getting a little out of control or a little excessive, but didn't have the fortitude to take that next step and say that. But I'm not going to second guess that. I wasn't there. I didn't have a crowd yelling at me. You know, should it not have happened? Absolutely shouldn't have happened.
Right.
But when you look at the facts and the general relation that this nation's law enforcement have, you know, there's over 500,000 police officers nationwide in this country. You know, out of that 500,000 police officers, we have 10 million police community contacts as far as investigative crimes, violations, and such like that. You know, last year in 2019, we had 1,004 police deadly use of force incidents. All but 41 of them were armed with a weapon. So now you're talking 41. You know, the majority of the people killed by the police, justifiably or unjustifiably, with a weapon or without a weapon, are white. They're not black. You know, if you look at the 41 unarmed Americans that were killed by the police in 2019, in 3/4 of those cases, the police attempted to use non-lethal force before they resorted to lethal force. What the community doesn't understand is if I'm a police officer in uniform, or if I'm identified as a police officer and I'm dealing with you, and that becomes an aggressive confrontation because you're resisting, don't want to go to jail, or for whatever reason, I don't have the option to lose that fight. Everyone thinks it's a fair fight. It's not a fair fight. I have tools on my belt. There's pedestrians around that are watching this. Once that becomes a combative confrontation, there's not an option for me to lose that fight, because if I do, I will most likely lose my life, and maybe the witnesses around me who saw someone kill a police officer will lose their life because this individual now has my weapon. So even though that person is unarmed, doesn't mean they're a deadly threat to myself and the people around them.
Yes.
And we really need to look at that and train it. I mean, in all honesty, and I say this to media and politicians all over the place, you can take all day to try to handcuff me if I don't want to be handcuffed. You're not going to do it unless you use an extreme amount of force, or you're going to have a lot of help.
Right.
And the police department should get that lot of help. But at times when it's one-on-one situation, you can't get that help fast enough to save your own life.
Right.
But can we do better? Yes. But here's where the politicians and the mainstream media come into effect, that don't want to address this. They want to morph this lawful protest for what looks like an unjustified killing to a riot. They want to make the police out to be this boogeyman out there. We have these police that are the bad guys. That's your boogeyman. And I'm here. I'm the politician that's going to save you from those bad boogeymen, because they don't have to deal with the real problems. Then they're creating this false narrative that everyone spends all the time dealing with that, rather than really addressing the real problems of community police relations. And I know you touched on the stay-at-home orders and such with Andy before me. That has done nothing but destroy the police community relations even further. And these politicians are either welcoming that because they want us to be the bad guy boogeyman, or not even taking into account, because we have not only turned off the good people who normally support us in America, but the patriots who just want to live their lives as Americans by these unlawful, egregious, stay at home, wear a mask, must follow my rules, got to close your business orders, that are destroying the progress we've made over the past 2 decades of police community relations.
Oh, it's such a mess, Rob. Why would anyone want to be a police officer today?
They don't. I mean, look at the departments hiring, anywhere across the nation are having such trouble getting qualified officers to even join up or sign up, or officers are leaving the big cities or these Democratic run, monopolies that for better pastures to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
I would have been honored to have my son or something to follow my footsteps. An NYPD detective. That's there's been more movies made about that than most any other professions in the world.
Yeah.
It was an honor to do that. I loved serving the people, and I served it honorably and well, and was recognized for that. But I actually sent my son into the armed services. Well, I didn't send him. He chose the armed services over my advice, because I don't want him to follow my footsteps in the NYPD as what's going on today. It's just not something I would recommend to my loved ones or friends at this point. There's other options out there. Why, even with all the help you want to do and can do, I've done a lot of help in my life. With the climate of today, it's a no-win situation, and every police officer out there is one bad day, one wrong decision, split-second decision of being on the news of every news station in the country, along with every other law enforcement agent officer, that they're making this, that we're all bad and all don't know what we're doing. And
so many times the scapegoating, of course, does not fit the actual facts, and you can see it with your plain eyes, right? So the narrative here, in the wake of the outrage, justified outrage over the George Floyd incident, is that white supremacist cops are lurking in every corner waiting to murder Black people. And yet in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities, just a couple of years ago, there was a Somalian American police officer. I think he was with the Twin Cities force, who, it was just a terrible, tragic murder of a white woman who had been in her house. Do you remember this incident?
Yeah.
And there were no riots. There was no burning buildings. The Target was not looted. How do you explain that disparity? And then also, how is it that good law-abiding cops who protect and serve are supposed to combat this, this poisonous narrative that just really has fossilized in the public culture, despite what the facts show?
Yeah, your active police officers really can't. They are hogtied and restrained by police department, social media, policies. They cannot speak for themselves. They cannot represent even their own person as a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
If a police department, if someone found it offensive and contacts their police department, even if they were off duty on their own time, not wearing anything identifiable, that police department's going to hold them accountable. And that's where people like myself and members of Brothers Before Others who are retired, who can step out of the shadows and say, no, we need to, you can't fight every fight that's out there, but you need to fight the ones that come to your doorstep. When it's so egregious where you're labeling over 500,000 police officers nationwide as abusive and bad towards communities of color, when the stats and facts just do not support that. Are there incidents of it? There absolutely are. Let's fix them, but we can't fix them if we're combating false narratives all the time. And that's the politicians, that's the mainstream media's methodology with this, because they want that. They want that conflict. They want that confusion because it keeps them in business. It keeps their clicks going on, social media. Let's sit down and talk about what we could do to do better here. In this incident, not burn down our target, I just saw today that they burnt down a low-income housing project that was just being finished.
Yes.
Not destroy your community. We are in the middle of this pandemic. This Target was probably the primary location that these people can get their pharmacy goods, their groceries. They don't have that now. So look what they did. Look what they allowed to be done to their own community. And that's the good protesters. The good protesters who were there that were seeking change and information to make things better. I applaud them. If we all saw something was wrong here, and protests are the foundation of this nation to fix that. But within not even hours, within an hour, this peaceful protest looking for change turned into, let's get myself a high definition TV, candy, liquor and pharmacy goods from a Target and burn everything down and smash windows. I mean, all these things are going to have to be replaced. All these police cars, these taxpayers are going to have to pay for them. Where were the good protesters there, putting themselves in between these looters and putting their hands out and saying, no, enough's enough? That's what they want from us. That's what they want from us police department members, right?
Yeah.
If we see something bad, they want us to jump in and say, no, don't do that. That's not right. They wanted the other officers there to pull this officer off Mr. Floyd and say, stop that. Well, why aren't they doing it here as they burn down their own community? It's a two-way street. I want change. They want change. Well, let's look for that change. But with these false narratives saying, these police departments have these white supremacists, or police officers in general, are just abusive towards communities of color. Are there problems? Yes, but let's fix them. We can't fix them by always shouting each other back and forth, saying, based on false information and media headlines.
Yeah. So last question for you. We've seen this play out many times before, and my fear is that this is just the start. I mean, it was 6 years ago that it was the summer of Ferguson and Baltimore, and there were many ashes that were strewn across the country. What do you do if you are a police chief or a mayor talking to your police chief to gird your city or neighborhood for what might come? And is there anything that can be done to avert what seems inevitable every time one of these things starts?
Yeah, we're in a perfect storm right now because you have, amongst COVID, everyone's frustrated, and the country's basically a powder keg to begin with.
Yes.
The majority, and by majority, I'd say 90% of these rioters, these criminals that are in Minneapolis now, could care less about Mr. Floyd. They're just causing damage. They're just outing their frustration. They're just getting free stuff. When the city as a whole should be worried about, let's fix what happened to Mr. Floyd, not these things. What police chiefs and what mayors in this country need to do, instead of getting on TV and throwing their police officers under the bus and throwing and kowtowing to these media headlines because somebody said hands up, don't shoot, and that's the narrative at that point. They need to get the backbone they need and fortitude as leaders to stand in front of the media and say, I saw the same video you saw. it affected me the same way it affected you, and we will get to the bottom of this. And when wrongdoing is found, and when this is found guilty through the proper channels, this person will spend as much time in jail as I can see possible. But the members of this community, the members of the city, need to hold fast and trust that system, because the system does work. You know, it's not perfect. No system is perfect, but let it work. Let it go through the levels. When somebody commits a crime, they are arrested by the police. It's investigated by the police. It goes to a district attorney and in front of a judge. When a police officer commits a crime, it goes through those same processes, but yet it goes through a state attorney. It goes through an internal affairs investigation. It goes through a U.S. attorney's office. There are so much more levels there. And just because you don't like the outcome doesn't mean it wasn't just or within the law. I mean, regardless of how egregious this officer and Mr. Floyd's actions were, he is still offered due process. He's still afforded that system that we have in this country, and it should take its place. But instead of cowering to the mob rule, instead of patronizing, and at this point allowing them to riot and destroy a city, leadership of mayors and police chiefs need to stand fast and say, I will stand by my police department 100%. If you harm one of my police officers during this time, we will find you. We will send you to jail. In that case, that being said, this officer that's in question will be investigated fully, and when he's found guilty, will never wear this uniform and will maybe never see the light of day again. And I give you my word as your mayor, as your police chief, that's the fortitude we will have to see this through. And that's where leaders in the community, real protesters, need to come together with leadership like that in our mayors and police chiefs and look for that change.
I wish it would happen. I hope somebody's listening out there, Rob, and I appreciate everything that you do. I urge people to go to brothersbeforeothers.org and support the philanthropic work that Rob and his colleagues do to support families of fallen officers who've sacrificed their lives to protect and serve well and good. And of course, you can find more of Rob's writing at lawenforcementtoday.com. Thanks for joining us, Rob. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
Take care.